Okay, and why not just kick off? Folks will maybe continue to join in. Well, thank you all for joining us for the third of our Forest Dialogue lecture series in conjunction with Forest Streaming Paintings and Sculptures with Ana Flores. We're very glad to have the exhibition up in our building for another couple of weeks, but everyone is welcome to see these beautiful chair sculptures on our grounds at the Lyman Allyn Art Museum once the tree is removed. Give us another week and then it will be set. And so with that, just the Zoom etiquette is that we have several speakers. So we're going to run through the program without our chat on, but folks will be invited at the end of our program. If you have follow-up questions, to email our speakers. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Ana Flores.
Well, thank you, Eileen, for all you do to make these programs possible. And also, I'm just delighted to have the poets here with us today, and also very thankful that the museum has been very supportive of these public forest dialogue events, those that have been more public. I just wanted to say that as an artist, poetry is an essential tool for me. Metaphor and poetic thought is my way of deep diving into place. And I'm often delighted when I'm invited to places and I get to walk around the landscapes, not only with ecologists and environmentalists, but also the poets and writers who live there, because they have this deep sense of place and history that I learned so much from. And this book was introduced to me by Jose Gonzalez, who is one of the poets here today, and a poet that I've had a great pleasure of working with, and a friend now who is from New London and knows New London in a very special way because he has had a long history there, and he brings his own landscapes there from where he came. And Jose and I first worked together on an outdoor project in New London called Poetry of the Wild, where we planted poetry boxes throughout the community. And it was a way for the public to understand their community in a new way, really responding to the poetic writings of each box and seeing it through the landscape of writers and poets who see these places in their special way. So it's been a real joy to be reading this book, the Waking Up to the Earth. I read it in between coffee and tea time, and I've been savoring all the poets and all the places they bring to me, the celebrations of nature, the lamentations that are here in this book. So I'm just delighted to have this program featuring the Connecticut poets, the four of you who are so keen to place and to history and emotional sensibilities that we carry into the world. I also want to remind you that if you want this book, please search for it at the publisher, Grayson Publisher, or Amazon, or your local bookstores. One thing is the poets, another thing is to savor this book slowly and with your own time. So do buy the book. And with that said, please, I'd love the poets to take over. This is their day.
Thank you, Anna. I'm Margaret Gibson. I'm the editor of Waking Up to the Earth, Connecticut Poets in a Time of Global Climate Crisis. And I can't imagine a better way to reaffirm and reimagine our humans' relationship with the earth than to visit the work of Ana Flores, right currently now at the Lyman Art Museum. We are invited to dream in the forest, to muse, to be in a state of reverie, in which we might just realize that all beings and all living systems of life on this planet are kin and interrelated. If you saw those chairs, you can see that she knows how to make a wordless and eloquent presentation of our connection with the earth. Poets have always written about the earth, about our local habitation. Poets in their own particular and indigenous words and images say where they are, who they are, and what else lives with them in their surrounding world, be it terrestrial or oceanic, forested or plain, icebound or tropical. And poets, perhaps more than others, think about the roots of words, discovering that many words themselves, when one considers their origins, root us in the earth. So think of Anna's chair, think of yourself, or think of us, the poets today, sitting in those chairs, rooted in the earth, using words and images that are connected to the earth and rooted to the earth. One thing I want to say is that the poems in Waking Up to the Earth are written by poets who are waking up and paying closer attention to the earth. What these poets are waking up to in their different ways are a close kinship between poetry and ecology, both of which focus on interrelationship. A poem weaves an interrelated web of words and images. An ecosystem is all about interdependence and the energetic relationship of all sentient beings. So we are going to be hearing today, I'm going to tell you quickly about the format of our gathering. We have paired the poets. Jose Gonzalez and Dolores Hayden will begin first. And then Jon Anderson and I, Margaret Gibson, will join in later. The pairs of poets will each poet will read his or her poem. And then within that pairing, one poet will ask the other a question about their poem. And after that double exchange, which will take about 20 minutes, starting with Jose and Dolores, we will move on to Jon and me. And if there is time at the end of the program for your questions, we will talk among ourselves or take your questions. Let me just tell you who these wonderful poets are very, very briefly. Dolores Hayden is the author of Exuberance, a Connecticut Book Award finalist, and she's a professor emerita from Yale University. Jose Gonzalez is the author of Toys Made of Rock and another book, When Love Was Reels, R-E-E-L-S. He is a Fulbright scholar and the co-editor of Latino Boom. Jon Anderson is currently professor of English at Quinebaug Valley Community Center. His most recent book of poems, Augur, won the David Martinson Meadowhawk Prize and was a finalist also for the Connecticut Book Award in poetry. I'm currently the Poet Laureate of the state of Connecticut, and I have a new book out, The Glass Globe, which I invite you to purchase, along with this anthology. All right, let's begin with our first pair of poets, Dolores Hayden, Jose Gonzalez. Take us away.
All right, very good. Thank you, Margaret, so much. And thank you, Anna. And of course, always an honor to be involved with any project of yours. This is an amazing exhibit. If folks are just listening in and watching us, you haven't gotten the full experience just yet if you haven't been to Lyman Allyn to check out these works and to see these chairs, which, again, I guess we still have a week to go before we do that, but thank you both. I'm gonna begin with a cliche in the projects, and then Dolores is gonna read her poem. And these poems were both in this great anthology that Margaret put together. A cliche in the projects. So much of a cliche, that sunflower in front of 8-6, our apartment in the projects where the soil was so rough that barefoot kids would rub their feet after hopscotching in front of our door. That cliche took wandering wiffle balls to the neck and still stood stiff, barely a scratch. Back then, cops would walk or run by, chasing a name, and that cliche just minded its own, even when they caught the boy who shot Charlie. The third summer that the cliche came back, I started to notice a couple of other apartments had a flower or two in front of their doors. Mrs. Johnson even had a 1-foot flimsy fence around her geraniums. After we moved out, I would go out of my way to check out the apartment. Each time, the sunflower had grown so much that I swore I was shrinking. I don't go around there anymore. But the other day, I read a story in our local newspaper about an arrest next door to our old 8-6. The article didn't say anything about sunflowers, but maybe the writer just doesn't believe in cliches the way I do, the way some families are forced to. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose, and thanks to all of you who've organized this event, and to Margaret, the editor of our anthology, Waking Up to the Earth. I'm Dolores Hayden, and I will be reading In the Middle Lane, Leaving New Haven. Dust covers behind the billboard, we want your scrap gold. Behind the imported oil on the tank farm, the rusting metal on the export pier, the oversized flags on the auto dealer's lot. 4 out of 5 commuters drive alone. In the left lane, a black bus, shrink wrapped with characters for luck, hurtles past me toward the casino. On the right, a white limo accelerates to a wedding. Side by side, we surge past the hill, leveled for a mall. Who is the risk taker looking for grace? A cell tower marks frolic talk as I exit toward narrow roads that wind and rise and fall. I steer into the shapes of time. River Street, Water Street, curve with fishermen's work. Leeds Island Road weaves where farmers grew salt hay, and the last of the light fades on bone-colored Spartina. Who is the survivor mapping history? On Colonial Road, a developer has been clearing for new houses. Dispossessed, a doe and a buck wander onto the asphalt. Pay attention. Braking hard, headlights high, I hear an owl. I might as well be an owl, hooting at the ice, lecturing the winter. Snow coats the sand on the beach. Snow drifts over the seawall next to the Sound. On Cove Lane, my house resists the January wind, windows dark. My house is as cold as only a widow's can be. On the porch, shovel, rock salt, firewood. So the two of us are going to speak about our poems with you. And Jose, my question. In your poem, you mentioned living in public housing and planting a sunflower. Can you say a little more about gardening and trying to protect the earth while living in a housing project?
Yeah, you know, Dolores, the idea, right, of public and private, right, it's just something that when my family, when we first moved here, actually, when my sister and I were reunited with my parents, we have actually lived away from them for a bit, and we were separated as they earned enough money to bring the two of us here to literally to New London. We first lived in public housing and the projects, right? And we didn't quite know the rules, like, you know, as far as both like the implied rules and the legal rules, as far as, you know, living arrangements. We were impressed that we lived in what we called pretty spacious quarters, right? Even though they were projects compared to what we had back in El Salvador. To the extent, like, you know, when I say rules, I'm talking about like things like we sold these popsicles, for example. It was just Kool-Aid, frozen Kool-Aid that we made actually pretty decent amount of money. You know, back then it was like 10, 15 bucks. And next thing you know, the housing project folks sent out letters to all the residents, said, you can't do this. And so again, we planted without quite knowing this sense that we were or weren't supposed to do certain things. And so my mother planted, I think my mother and my sister actually planted these sunflowers, and one sunflower in particular seemed to get bigger and bigger. The soil there wasn't really very hardy, and to a certain extent, when I reflect on it, I think almost like, that A Raisin in the Sun, right? A play by Lorraine Hansberry, where sunflower, this flower is getting carried, right? Representative of so much. And so as I reflect on that, right, public versus private, it does make me think of the privilege that came with having more money, right, and having more resources. And so when we moved to our 2-family home in New London, still, we were still poor, but certainly better off than many others in the projects. And that's when my mother began to plant even more, right? When I say more, I mean roses, I mean vegetables, not just sunflowers. And throughout the years, again, as I continued to reflect, it really made me think about private versus public, right? And the limitations that come with privilege and with resources, right? For those who don't have them, I should say. So, I look at certain places and I think, well, that green space, right? What does it look like, and how accessible is it to those who don't have money, who don't have those resources? I think of the vacations that my family and I have taken or want to take. So I think of, for example, national parks, which is, our bucket list place. And I think of how Yosemite, for example, displaced Native Americans, right? So the creation of these national parks, right? And we tend to forget a little bit of that history. We went to New York City, and there's another example, right? Central Park, this intentionally designed urban green space that wound up displacing African-American communities. And that even now, when you walk around it, we have probably some of the most expensive houses in the world, right? Never mind in the US. And so the poem, to a certain extent, is envisioning that green space and that I think that back and forth between private interests and interests, financial interests, and sometimes those eco interests that we might have, and it also made me reflect on that, what it means to have green space, and do people always envision green space as having brown and black space, right? Or does green space always come necessarily with simply white space? And so that poem to me, when I think of these sunflowers, I think of quite a bit, actually. I don't think it's a poem that I would have written years ago, but it's a poem that now, as I reflect, it really does make me think about resources and who gets to be green, right? But I also had a question for you, Dolores, and that question, when I first read your poem, there's one line when you say pay attention, and it comes right around the time when we see the deer coming, but at the same time I thought, well, what is she referring to, that pay attention? Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I'm glad you picked out that phrase. Essentially, it's a poem about commuting at one level. In the city of New Haven, the speaker passes the tank farm that holds the imported oil, and the port where the largest export is scrap metal. So that is junked appliances and cars. And further out, speaker drives by a hill which has been leveled for a mall, and then passes woods that have been cleared for a new tract of houses. So these are scenes in one way or another of waste and careless consumption. And because of the tract, the doe and the buck have been dispossessed. They wander into the road near where they used to be in the woods. And the speaker is not paying enough attention. The speaker is musing about history and landscapes, instead of paying attention. The immediate danger, of course, is colliding with the dough in the buck, but the larger danger is failing to understand the dimensions of climate crisis and failing to really understand how fast we are destroying the earth through waste and careless consumption. I think these elements were always in the poem, but being involved in this event with all of you has been extremely interesting. I reread books like The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells and thought again about how it's not enough to simply worry about one's own neighborhood or one's own family. The largest implications are not even about one's nation, but about the globe, and how difficult it is often for us to imagine the entire globe, and the way that climate crisis is accelerating in all parts of the globe, but particularly parts of the globe where we may not ourselves live. And that would maybe lead me to another question for you, Jose, which is, in the poet, you mentioned cliche. Why do you say cliche? And what made you choose that title?
So first of all, yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with what you're saying as far as paying attention. It's so easy not to pay attention to what else is going on in the world, and yet here we are, right, being affected and affecting others so easily. It's scary. So the cliche, you know, that comes from. So when I was first floating my manuscript for my first book, I got this feedback, right? This one publisher, 3 reviewers, one of them said, I like it. The other one said, it's so-so. And another one who said, this is a cliche. And I thought, this is my life. What are we talking about? This is a cliche here. And so I've thought a lot about that as I've written throughout the years. And even though I had never written a poem where I intentionally called something a cliche, I thought this is the kind of poem where we're talking about this. It's almost a cliche, right? I mean, the fact that, you know, there's someone whose family is living in housing projects and is planting this sunflower, right? That's getting taller and taller, right? And that, you know, it could be representative of so much, it could be symbolic of so much, and yet it's real. And yet at the same time, it made me think about how what we pay attention oftentimes isn't so much those kinds of efforts, those kinds of stories, but instead, you know, I mentioned in there, you know, when Charlie got shot, right? That's the kind of story that makes it to the day, right? That's the kind of coverage that is rampant in newspapers versus a story about, you know, some kind of green initiative, right? Planting trees, you know what I'm saying? And so, and then I go back to maybe some families just have to believe in that cliche, which is pretty much what I think in many ways my family did, right? Throughout. So that's, to me, that's what I think of anyway. I want to go back to you because I think we have a little bit of time for another question for you. And so, because I was really, your poem, you know, I think about all the drives that I've taken, and you take us through that drive through New Haven, right through 95 and all throughout the city. How does any person's commute from suburb to inner city and back again, would you say, how does that contribute to climate change?
Well, I think combating climate change requires everyone to give much more careful attention to ordinary everyday activities. And in the sense that your sunflower represents a whole attitude of a family of surviving and surviving in a new place, I think for people who have perhaps been living in suburbs and driving to work, there's another kind of contemplation that's necessary, thinking about our energy consumption and what we take for granted every day. Now, for the last 7 or 8 decades, the federal government in the United States has promoted a kind of spread out metropolitan region as our way of living. We've become a suburban nation. And that means investments in things like highways, subsidies for malls, and home mortgages, mostly for white male-headed families. So if we really want to take seriously what it is that we're doing in terms of energy consumption in this country, we have to think about our culture, our politics, and think about how we have developed housing patterns and transportation technologies that waste land and natural resources. And it's a pretty grim accounting. So much of the world's resources has been squandered, largely by high consuming nations like the United States with these kinds of settlement patterns. And we need to really think too about why energy consumption here is so destructive elsewhere. So I live along the coast and people say, well, coastal flooding, I guess that's global warming, but it's more than coastal flooding. It's all the droughts and the heat waves and the forest fires and the desertification of farmland. And this is happening not just in this country, but in the rest of the world, especially in the global south. And that leads millions of climate refugees to flee uninhabitable places, which, Jose, seemed to be a bit of an echo in your other poem. So maybe we should conclude with that. I liked your second poem as well as I liked the first one. And certainly this is the land in El Salvador, making it very, very difficult for people to earn a living there.
Yeah, thank you.
Perhaps to end on.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because it's a point that I think gets lost with when we talk about immigration, right? And we put all these resources, like you're saying, in certain areas, but and when it comes to immigration, we think of how to stop people, but we don't think of stopping this fall, right? This great fail, actually, in terms of climate change, right? And so how do we go about how do we go about helping immigrants? I mean, one of the most important areas, I think, is looking at climate, right?
Yes.
And the predictions are dire. By 2050, we're looking at, not only deforestation, we're looking at, it's not just the temperatures, it affects, of course, the livestock, it affects their agriculture. And so not surprisingly, anytime we have, this, whether it be a hurricane or whatever else, these rains, whatever they might be, not surprisingly, after we hear all these deaths, we're going to continue to hear of more migration patterns. Hopefully at some point, take your word, pay attention. We'll be paying more and more attention to that and actually doing something about it. So
I think once people understand climate refugees are fleeing uninhabitable places, it makes the global nature of the crisis much, much clearer. It is not a separate immigration crisis and a climate crisis of some other kind. Absolutely. But these things are very tightly connected in ways that we need to perceive and talk about all the time.
Absolutely. Well said. Looks like we're close to our time, and so maybe at this point we should transition over back to Margaret
and Jon. Yes,
and Jon, of course.
Thank you both, Dolores and Jose. For those listening in that think that books about nature and poems about nature are only about birds and trees and lyric moments when you splash in the brook, I hope you're getting a wonderful change of point of view in learning that, nature is everything. It's life itself. It's all of us, and the various kinds of interconnections and implications that we go through, or that connect us and raise these kinds of issues. Environmental injustice, social and economic injustice all stem from the sense that we are separate and divided from each other, but also from the natural world. everything stems from separation and division, in my view. So Jon, we're going to read our poems, and then we have a few questions, and hopefully we have time to wrap up. Okay?
Sure. Would you like me to go first?
You first.
Okay. I'm going to read The Call of the Void, which was included in Margaret's anthology. As you'll find out in the poem, The Call of the Void is an English translation for a French term, l'appel du vide, which describes that sensation many people get when standing on a precipice. That feeling, that pull towards the void, the pull to jump, even though one is not suicidal. And then of course one steps back. The Call of the Void. I was 7, leaning into the wind on the bluff, 20 feet or so above surging, retreating waves. Something snagged in my breath, radiating like voltage through my chest into my skinny arms, legs. I craned my neck, shaking, this terrifying new possibility. 2 me's, and one wanted to step out into the high salt air. As Americans, we have no word or phrase for this yearning wired to the leap and fall. But last night, as we lay awake, listening to the walls tick with insects, you told me the French call it l'appel du vide. Now, here, you and I stand at the edge of the garden we planted in blistering spring heat. Into this life I still love, and watch new beetles flock to, then mass upon squash blossoms. The goldfinch, here like a spark, a coulomb of sun in the squally afternoon, darts and darts back, hops and flits, tells us what we already know. There is no backing or turning away, no shrugging off, only holding hands. We step into, we follow the whole human race, step into the swollen sun and storms of whatever this will be.
Thank you, Jon. I am actually reading a poem that is not in the anthology. And the reason for that is that my poem in the anthology, Irrevocable, is so long and we have time constraints. But the one I'm reading because of Anna's forest dreaming. I also live in the woods. My late husband and I purchased for very little money a farmer's woodlot, and we live surrounded by trees and a forest ecosystem that is just wonderful. And for years, I gardened, we dug wells, we did a lot of things that were always involved work and always involved connection with the earth. And as a kid, I used to run away from home to the dogwood tree in my neighbor's yard, climb the tree with my books, and spend the day reading a book in a tree. Or books in trees. So this poem is called Once. Once there were women who read books in trees. I've heard it from their own lips, these stories, and I was one of them. I lay back in the Y branch of a dogwood tree, sun in the green leaves, a rain of petals on the grass beneath me. Once, women washed in the watershed rainfall of streams that tumbled down mountains and into the plains below. I knew a woman who dug herself a well, another who raised rabbits and killed them clean, skinned them as I might slip off a winter coat I no longer need. Once there were women who worked fields in the hot sun, and afterwards their work done roamed the edges where field met forest, where at sundown the deer roused after dozing for hours in the chicory and Queen Anne's lace. I know one woman who spoke her poems aloud, standing at the edge of a field of tall grasses so that the rabbits and the mice and the red-tailed hawks could hear words on the wind. And the wind rose and a thunderstorm broke. She tells how lightning took down an oak the way she'd take a lover. Once there were women who fed themselves on roots, who drank milk straight from the udders of wild oxen, who knew herbs and mushrooms, simples and cures. These days, if anyone thinks of these women at all, it's to dismiss them as primitive or pagan or savage. But I know how they held their bodies as they walked there just once on this earth. I know how they wept and laughed, how they loved. Once there were salmon, meadowlarks, herds of elk. Once there were groves of oaks to pray in. Once there were avenues of plane trees in the cities. Once there were words with wings. Once, when thunderstorms billowed and broke, the thick heat cleared out, the air rinsed clean. Once farm, once forest, once city, once field, bridge, and tower. Once words had roots that entered the deep earth as a lover might enter a woman. Once there were women who read books in trees.
Thank you, Margaret.
It is all one world. You see how the landscapes change, however, as we go from one to one. The trick is to find the way they're all connected. Jon, I want to have a question for you. Are you ready?
I think so.
What strikes me about this wonderful poem of yours is the juxtaposition of the two time periods and the two landscapes. A tall bluff 20 feet over the sea when you were 7. And then as at the edge of the verdant garden, you and your wife Denise stand out with all the details of buzzing and blooming life. And yet, at that moment, you may as well be, the entire race may be, poised to tumble into who knows what. I'd like you to elaborate on that juxtaposition. Did the cliff come first to your mind, the memory of fear at the edge and the longing to tumble and the fear of it? Or did the garden come to you first, its edge and global climate crisis in your mind? And when did you know you'd link the two moments?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I so appreciate these conversations because, it brings us back into the pieces. We write with a conscious mind, but also a subconscious mind. The memory of the cliff is, that's been with me for years, that first experience of Lapel du Vide. So, as an image or experience, it's knocked around in my head for many years. But the garden is always there too. Not magically, we put it there deliberately every spring. To be honest, I can't totally recreate. I'm not sure what is root and what is tendril there, what came first. If I were writing a paper, I'd be compelled to say that it's hard to ignore the idea that, you're standing at the edge of a garden, at the edge of a fall, as not being some kind of, prelapsarian state. So, when we talk about the call of the void, I said that actually there's no English phrase for this. That's not completely true. Scientists have studied this and they call it less, with the less poetic term, high place phenomenon. But we're not talking about people who are suicidal. We're talking about anyone standing and having these sudden and intrusive thoughts. And so there's this compulsion to leap forward. And there's this will to survive that holds us back. And so in a way, we might think of this as actually there's an affirmation to live. And so, regardless of what the exact truth of the science is and, what's behind this, there's this paradoxical existential conflict. And we're all poised there. I appreciate greatly Jose's comments about public versus private, and Dolores, insisting on attentiveness, not only to where we are very literally, but also to politics and power, those things that are operating behind the scenes. I don't think that it's a coincidence that we are poised at the edge of the precipice with the call of the void, as public spaces are disappearing, as the very idea of public institutions are under attack. That drive towards separation that Margaret mentioned, those inequalities of power that exist. So yeah, I think that's how I connect it. And it was probably very organic in that way. I mean, our gardens are organic, but there's an organic, organic element to this. And certainly gardens have always been with us. I grew up, growing gardens with my parents, and they were a form of sustenance. It meant that the grocery bill would be less,
Yeah. In your poem too, there's a moment at night of the two of you lying in bed talking about that memory of standing on the cliff, and you're given the phrase l'appel du vide, the language for it. But what I was struck by was how that moment brought a great intimacy into the poem. We're always one person with another, hopefully. Sometimes we're by ourselves, but searching for a way to feel at home here with each other and on this earth. And I wondered if you could add some more comments about the importance of not letting this just become a discussion about statistics, but in which we also open our hearts to each other and with each other, and allow a kind of new intimacy to flourish.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I appreciate that question. Poetry has always been for me, an inside out, outside in sort of process. The power of poetry to make, to bring the world inside, and for us to realize when we're looking out towards the world, we're also looking from within us, through a lens that's informed by our histories that we bring with us. And I have a hard time separating what's out there and what's in here. And I think that it's important that poetry remind us and enacts how the world is very intimate, even these very, abstract or abstractable concepts of power. We feel them in our gut. And, in a way, in terms of the composition of the poem, I think I was just kind of trying to honestly communicate the fear that I feel around the climate crisis, and also who I turn to for strength and sustenance and solidarity. It's a very intimate thing, and I think about our kids, and I think about our kids' kids, and thinking about it in those terms, in very intimate, personal, in the gut, close-up terms, helps us really understand, and really see what's at play and what's at stake here. In a way, this is a part of the problem of the climate crisis, in that we do, unfortunately, need to sometimes feel things really up close before we start to, believe them, or believe how bad it can be, in ways that the statistics don't quite carry. But there is this, there is this real fear. I think about the call to the call of the void in a way. If I can critique my own poem, one place the metaphor breaks down is that we're not standing on the precipice. we're pitched over it. We're already tumbling. And, even though that's true, even now, I'm not ready to give up. I'm not ready to throw in the towel. There are lots of things to do. There are handholds. There are places to grab. The work is more urgent. But even now, especially now, it's not time to give up. And if we're not going to give up, we have to turn to each other, not as an abstract notion, but in real space in real time.
Speaking of which, we're getting close to our time, so maybe you better turn to me and ask me your question.
Yeah, sure. So my question for you, Margaret, your poem has this incredible gathering power. And one key to that, I think, is your choice of litany as a poetic technique. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Okay, thank you. It's really hard, as one of us said earlier, to think about the death of the earth or to think about the earth as a whole. We have to approach things in particulars. We have to take things one by one, and then hopefully there's a gathering power of addition. Even we're adding what we have had and lost, we're still there. So there's a list technique, but a litany is something a little more. A litany, the root of the word litany is entreaty, and it usually has a musical quality. It's got a liturgical use. Someone says something, and then there's a call and response, and the response is usually the same words. So there's repetition, there's musical energy and so forth. And there's, in the list of things that are rhapsodized or praised or whatever, there's often an internal organization to hold them together so that you're not just listing things at random. So I began thinking just about myself in the tree, reading, and thinking of that as an image of the unity of mind and body, of the unity of the human and the natural, not the separation of mind and body that has resulted in so much disastrous thinking, both theologically, psychologically, and environmentally. And although this poem is not a wish to go back to the primitive, listing women is, rather than men or others, is very conscious, because women have been in earlier times associated with life givers, the body, Mother Earth, but then denigrated and disempowered also. It's not hard to also use Mother Earth, the earth, to our own ends. I wanted to remind people that women have had a very close and primitive connection to the earth. In our technological age now, there are kids who never even play outside in forests, much less dream in them or plant a tree or dig a well or learn how closely and intimately, with dirt under our fingernails and sweat pouring down our bodies, we work this earth and we work on it and we live in partnership with the earth. So part of it was to celebrate those women. Part of the incantatory part of the litany is the word once itself. And there's a real turn in the poem, but I know how the women who lived there just once on this earth. And then the poem really skids on that word once, which has been tying things together sort of tactfully in the list of the women. But right at the end of the poem, the word once is used any number of times. Once there was, once fields, forests, once cities, bridge, tower, once, just once. The poem is pleading. We have this one time on our life, on earth ourselves, as a human race, the moment by moment appreciation of living once and living now is very much in jeopardy. And the poem invites us to be inclusive, to realize that everything is endangered. We can't afford separation. We can't afford to live divided lives. We can't afford racism or economic injustice. We can't afford the rape of the earth. It's a life and death struggle. And it's a struggle that it's always been a struggle to live. It's always been a celebration to celebrate our lives on this earth. So although liturgy and litany have very often involved entreaty, they've also involved celebration. So at the end of this poem, it takes a sudden turn into all of this is gone. So there's one thing that happens, I think, now in elegiac poetry about the environment is that we jump forward. I see poets do this all the time, a jump forward into the future to contemplate, to help us contemplate what we love by trying to imagine losing it. When you know it's fragile and impermanent, and that we humans have a responsibility in creating a climate, a way of living on this earth that has affected adversely the climate and ourselves, then that is a cause for grieving. It is also a cause for coming together to celebrate, hopefully, to work and celebrate our ability to change our lives in a way that is sustaining and affirmative. Every time I listen to the poets in this, read their poems, Dolores, Jose, Jon, thank you so much for representing this work and reading your poems today. Whenever I hear them, I think, yes, we do have a voice. We can raise them. We can do something. And I firmly believe that. That's the motive behind the book. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for that wonderful answer that connected so much together. Do I have time for another question, or should we?
I don't know. We've got
gather
5 minutes
together
of free. What's your question?
Well, I didn't give you a heads up on this one, but I mean, and in a way, you anticipated a little bit. You know, you've written so much about the climate, and it occurs to me, you know, Earth Elegy, you know, collecting so many years of poems together, that with Elegy, you are also celebrating and resisting, saying it doesn't have to be the end. So I was wondering about how this poem fits into, you know, the body of your work and continues that.
Well, it's a new poem, and it continues what's going on in my most recent book, the one that's just out, The Glass Globe, which links, you know, my personal grief over the death of my late husband to Alzheimer's, with that personal grief is intertwined with a kind of environmental or global grief as we tumble into climate crisis. I think we have always known that the personal is political. Well, recently, but I've always known since I woke up sometime back in the 70s that the personal is political. And now I think we need to wake up to the fact that the personal is global, and the global is very personally our responsibility. I used to, as a good little girl raised as a capitalist, raid the natural world for metaphors to talk about myself and my feelings and my state of mind and all of that. Gradually in my work, I started talking about the natural world for its own sake, this earth for its own sake. That was long about the time of the anthology you mentioned, Earth Elegy. More and more aware, of course, of the dangers of our predicament now has just tilted me more into, I'm not a one subject poet exactly, but these days I seem to be that way. I think it is a crisis we are in the midst of, and we would We need to bring all of our resources, verbal, political, social, human, bring it together and work. I still think that the waking up is a way of being an advocate. It may happen inside you. Yes. Waking up to the earth. Connecticut Poets in a Time of Global Climate Crisis. Let me just ask our listeners to go buy the book. You can go to www.grayson, Grayson, graysonbooks.com and order the book. Read the words of the amazing poets in it and join us. Raise your voices, write your poems, write your stories, write your letters to the editor. Talk to your neighbors, do whatever, find out what is going on where you live, and realize we can't all do it as consumers. We have to do it as human beings who want to live in a community on this earth. So, thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for
Thank you,
bringing us
Margaret.
together.
Thank you, Dolores, Jose, John.
Well said, Margaret.
Thank you, Anna Flores. Thank you, wherever you are, Eileen Donovan, who knows I am a technological primitive, but she knows how to really put this together. Yay. Thank you.
Any final words from you?
Excuse me?
Any final words, Anna?
I just want to say I am just so in awe of this extraordinary afternoon that you've created for us, to have the privilege to see you go back and forth because you're all such thoughtful, eloquent people. It's just, you've woken us all up. And I just hope everyone takes a deep dive with their own time into this beautiful book. This afternoon has been such a joy. Thank you.
And the best place to read this book is at the Lyman Allyn after you've been to Anna Flores's exhibit, which I think is stunning. Stunning.
Well, thank you. You're very kind. But really, I can't thank you all enough. This is all I wanted it to be. I just wish you have a recorded event. So share this with your friends. It's very special.
This will be up on our website, and give us a week if you don't mind. But yes, thank you all so much for joining us, and knowing that we, to have our guests speak as much as they could. If you have any questions that you want to follow up, you can reach myself at donovan@lymanallyn.org. You can reach Anna at earthinform.com or Margaret at brokencupgibson@gmail.com. We all welcome any ways to continue this important dialogue and conversation. And yes, buy the book and read it while spending some time in the gardens at the Lyman Allyn. So thank you all so much, and enjoy a lovely afternoon. And head outside.
And thanks to all of you out there who have joined us this afternoon. Your presence is important.